Thank you so much, Liz. And thank you all for joining us on what is turning out to be a beautiful Tuesday evening here in the Richmond region for those of you that are local. So I appreciate you taking the time to be in front of a screen for a little bit to chat with us tonight about the history, the development of the lost cause, the legacies of the lost cause mythologies, and those who have been resisting the lost cause mythology since it originated in the 19th century. And I'm going to dig into a little bit more about what it is that we are doing as I share my screen. So for those of you who have not been to the Valentine recently, just the briefest of overviews that we do have Richmond History Galleries, a number of exhibits that change over, including our long-term exhibit. This is Richmond, Virginia that you see here. We also have the Wickham House that was constructed for the Wickham family between 1812 and 1814, and then moved onto our property in 1937 is the Edward Valentine Sculpture Studio. This building was used by Edward Valentine actively as a sculpture studio from the 1870s into the 19-teens, and we are in the process of reinterpreting it. A little backstory, starting in 2020, we decided that this space, while it had been in need of some work, some reinterpretation that had been sort of on the to-do list, but was not at the forefront. But after the social justice protests of 2020, after the murder of George Floyd, we decided this would be a great opportunity for the Valentine to really dig in, reinterpret this space, and think a lot more broadly about the lost cause mythology. And I like to say the tentacles that it has had in our society and how it's still affecting us today. In 2020, late 2020, we formed a committee of local historians and also did a community-wide survey and some focus groups and put together an interpretation plan, knowing that it's important what we're doing here in this particular space, but also partnering with Liz and her team to make sure that the histories that we're trying to tell, the stories that we're trying to tell, the truths that we're trying to tell are also making it off of our campus and out into the community. So one of the big products in 2021 was a renewed partnership with Art Glass. And so we are now doing walking tours of Monument Avenue. Those are continuing this summer as well. So feel free to sign up and book one of those. Also in 2021, we partnered with an exhibition design team out of New York, Studio Joseph. And the principal architect, Wendy Joseph, has been working with us now for a number of months, helping us rethink strategically these 600 square feet. So this is a very small place. And what I am going to run through tonight is the historical content, the history content that we're hoping to cover, again, in this very small space. We have been actively working with our co-curators on this project. Again, I am a curator at the Valentine, but for this project, I am just the project manager. And we've hired Josh Epperson, who is an exhibit writer for the Smithsonian. He's also involved locally, and Kate Sunderland, who is writing her PhD on Edward Valentine and has been involved with the Valentine, studying his plaster casts since 2016 and 2017. So we've been wrestling with the content for a while, and for those of you who might have been on campus this spring, we have been workshopping this content and this theme, which is power play. We also have, within the last month, y'all, have had some great updates physically to this space that we have since removed the glass that was once a physical barrier. We have also done some moisture testing. We know that we have a significant amount of architectural work that we need to do to bring this building back to life. And we also spent a week last month working again with a local business to 3D scan a number of these artifacts, both for record imagery as well as making sure that we have all of our options available to us when it comes to that final interpretation. But we also, again, are wrestling with this historic content. There's so much history in Richmond, and the history of power is one that might not seem really familiar to you, but power is something I think that we all wrestle with. We're constantly thinking about power, and sort of traditionally defined, Merriam-Webster does define power as the ability to act, right? The ability to act and produce an effect is how Merriam-Webster has defined power. And then there's also, and I'm not a scientist, but I love scientists, they, in physics, the calculation for power is the amount of work over a span of time. And I think especially when we're talking about the long periods of time that we're looking at, right, from the 1860s and even looking back earlier into the 18th and 19th centuries, the history of power here in Richmond, the time component, I think, is also really important. Particularly, we're going to spend most of this program talking about the lost cause mythology, which was really a misinformation campaign to alter the public memory or the public's thought, what they could recollect about the Civil War, its causes, and its aftermath. So obscuring the history of slavery as the true cause of the Civil War, promoting white supremacy in all forms, and really just underplaying, undervaluing, denigrating the power of Black Richmonders, Black Virginians, and Black Americans. So we are going to start with I think the easiest one, which is money. So Richmond was the capital of the Confederacy. And in 1865, the Capitol burned. There was a huge fire, the evacuation fire. We do see in this picture, you can actually see that not all buildings were burnt to the ground. They're actually in the far background there. You're actually seeing the Tredegar Iron Works. And the Tredegar Iron Works, they were protected during that evacuation fire, and actually were revived quite soon after the end of the Civil War. And one of the families, the main family that owned and operated Tredegar Iron Works was the Anderson family. And you see here, this is Joseph Anderson. He started Tredegar Iron Works, made a ton of money, even before, during, and after the Civil War. Ironworks continued to be a major factor in Richmond's economy well into the 20th century. And he was able, after he passes away, he's able to pass down a significant chunk of money to two of his daughters. You see here Marion Mason Anderson Williams holding one of her children, and then also her sister Sally Archer Anderson. And these two women become very active in Richmond in the 1880s and 1890s, and use the fortune that they had inherited to support what we would call nonprofits today, but they were their social causes that they wanted to lift up. And so they very actively contributed funds to the Association for the Preservation of Virginia Antiquities. Today, that group is called Preservation Virginia, still active in the Richmond region. They also brought about in 1895 the Richmond chapter of the United Daughters of the Confederacy. And then also, we're very active in bringing about the Confederate Memorial Literary Society, which was established in 1890 to promote the history of the Confederacy through the lens of the lost cause. And then they opened in 1896 the Museum of the Confederacy, that's now today operated by the American Civil War Museum. And these institutions that they provided money to were all about, they were very vocal that they were promoting white histories. They were saving buildings that were connected to white families. And so this is one of those ways that one of the old money families of Richmond, the Andersons, is able to actually physically affect the city in what buildings are preserved. They're also able to affect what histories are being told to middle-class citizens that are coming from all across the country to see the Museum of the Confederacy, visit homes that are being preserved by the APVA, and of course the literacies that are taught by the UDC, and we'll talk more about those later. Another old family, old money family, that we are very familiar with at the Valentine is the Wickham family. So the Wickhams are, of course, established here in Richmond before the Civil War. You're seeing here the garden view of the Wickham house. This was built for John Wickham, but his grandson, who you see here, Williams Carter Wickham, moved out to Hanover and lives at his dad's house called Hickory Hill. You can see here an image of Hickory Hill out in Hanover. It is a traditional plantation prior to emancipation in 1865. And I would also like to here highlight Betsy Christian. This is a portrait that we have in our collection of Betsy Christian, who was enslaved at Hickory Hill by Williams Carter Wickham. After the war, after emancipation, Williams Carter Wickham does not try to revive the agrarian economy around Hickory Hill. In fact, he brings down capital from New York, lots of money from actually some family connections in New York, heavily invests in railroads, and becomes, I'm going to go back to his picture here while I'm talking about him, and becomes the vice president of the C&O Railroad, actually takes the train in from Ashland to Richmond every day. And so after he passes away in 1888, his former Confederate veterans, along with his colleagues from the C&O Railroad, hire Edward Valentine to create this statue of him that is installed in 1891 in Monroe Park. Now, this statue actually only takes about 2 to 3 years to get constructed, so relatively short order for Richmond public art. But I would like to note that this is the first statue that is felled by protesters during the summer of 2020, so no longer on view. Now the Wickhams and the Andersons, these are old money families, certainly old money white families. There's a lot of new money that comes back to Richmond after the Civil War, and Lewis Ginter, seen here, is one of the men who's bringing in a lot of capital to the city. He is also making a lot of money on tobacco. You actually see here Allen and Ginter's Allen and Ginter tobacco tin in our collection. He also heavily invests in cigarette manufacturing and begins to mint money off of cigarettes here in Richmond and reinvests that money in real estate developments. So you are overlooking here Union Theological Seminary and see in the background the construction of Ginter Park neighborhood, named for him as his personal real estate development. He also, in the center of town, has constructed the Jefferson Hotel. And as a part of this major real estate development, he commissions, yet again, Edward Valentine to create this statue of Thomas Jefferson that is then placed inside the atrium of the namesake hotel. So there is a trend here. You're seeing folks with money, whether it's old money or new money, investing in the physical places that are telling our stories, telling our histories here in Richmond. And the Valentine family is another new money family that is doing the same thing. So this is our founder, Man S. Valentine II. He's also the brother of the sculptor of this bust, Edward Valentine. And Man Valentine makes a lot of money. You see a portrait of him here in the background. These are his sons who go on to open a museum, the Valentine Museum, that also is endowed with $50,000 because of meat juice, which, y'all, meat juice is exactly what you think it is. It is pressed cow, boiled down, very iron rich, and really was a patent medicine from the 1870s all the way through into the 20th century. But Man Valentine made buku money off of meat juice and was able to invest that money in an art collection, in an archaeological collection, and an ethnographic collection, including he and his sons did go out and destroy Native American burial grounds in Western Virginia and Western North Carolina in order to have these ethnographic materials to display in their museum. There is also, in the early museum, there's also sculpture casts that come from Europe. And the whole space is stratified to prioritize the history of white Virginians and Western civilization, and I'll use air quotes there, Western civilization, with European history, and denigrating the history of Indigenous peoples and Black Americans as well. So this museum is geared towards the middle class, very popular with middle class Richmonders. But there is another story here, right? I've talked about white families that are telling histories. There's also Maggie Walker. Maggie Walker gets her initial engagements in Richmond's culture by joining up with the Independent Order of St. Luke. It's a fraternal burial organization. And she then is able to use her involvement with St. Luke to establish in 1902, she becomes the first woman president of the St. Luke's Penny Savings Bank. And you can see her here inside that bank. So there is the growth of a Black middle and a Black upper class here in Richmond after emancipation. It takes about a generation. We start to see property ownership begin to rise in the 1880s and the 1890s. There's also another gentleman I'd like to mention as well, who was close associates with Maggie Walker, and you see here John Mitchell Jr. And one of the stories that I think is that we could tell and sing from the rooftops even more. When thinking of the value of money and the power that you can wield, you can certainly wield it by spending it, but you can also wield monetary power by not spending it. And Maggie Walker and John Mitchell Jr. In 1904 organize a boycott against Richmond's streetcar system. In 1904, Virginia had just passed a law that allowed, this is after Plessy versus Ferguson, just passed a law that allowed segregated public facilities. And Maggie Walker and John Mitchell Jr. Lead this boycott. And for 2 years, Richmond's Black community does not utilize the most available transportation system in the city, and they actually drive out of business the Virginia Electrical Power and Railway Company. So just, I love thinking about money. You can spend it, but you can also not spend it and still exert your power. In the same way, in February of 1960, you have 34 students from Virginia Union sit in at a number of lunch counters around Richmond, including, you see the physical lunch counter in front of you is from Woolworths here in Richmond, and the photograph is depicting the same sit-in at the same time at GC Murphy's. And so these students, were protesting equal rights. They wanted equal access to these public facilities. It would still be 5 years away, though, with the 4 years away with the Civil Rights Act of 1964. The next year, Voting Rights Act of 1965 is actually a really good lead-in to the next type of power that was used to bring about the lost cause mythology, and that is politics. So political power, right? Maggie Walker does not have significant access to political power before she is allowed the vote in 1920 as a woman. But by being a Black woman, she has even more difficulty, although she herself was able to register and vote, but other Black women in Richmond were not able to vote en masse. Why is that? So looking back, we do have to start with 1865, and I'm going to show here Richmond's mayor for about 10 years, from 1853 until 1865. This is Joseph Mayo, and this is Edward Valentine's very sad bust of Joseph Mayo. He looks kind of floppy. But maybe after being mayor of Richmond for 10 years, this is what you end up looking like. But Joseph Mayo and other Virginians in 1865 and in early in 1866 do what the rest of the former Confederate states do as well. And they pass what are called black codes. And these black codes actually prevent Black Americans, Black men, from voting by saying it is illegal for Black men to vote. It did not need to be codified into federal law because the 14th Amendment hadn't passed yet. And it takes the passage of the 14th Amendment, it takes the Civil Rights Act later in 1866 to actually allow for Black men across the South, these newly freed people, as well as the formerly free Black men, to be able to exercise their power to vote. And in October of 1867, in Virginia, 92,000 Black men do vote as a part of electing a new constitutional convention. And so as a part of that convention, they do elect 24 Black representatives. They go on to pass what is called the Underwood Constitution, which is Virginia's first constitution that provides for universal male suffrage. No property requirements, no poll taxes associated with that. Clearly, no race requirements were attached to that Underwood Constitution. And with the Underwood Constitution, you see a biracial coalition governing Virginia from the late 1860s all the way through into the early 1880s. By the late 1870s, there is a new political party that has come about as a partnership between Black Republicans, again, party of Abraham Lincoln, Black Republicans, along with radical Republicans and some former Confederates, in fact. They formed the Readjuster Party. And I love this, y'all. I could go into the weeds on the Readjuster Party, but their sole goal was to readjust the state debt to fund public education. And they did it. They are able to open up what is now Virginia State University. They equitably fund Black public schools, segregated, but still funding schools for Black children all across the state. After achieving their goal, they immediately fall apart as a coalition. And in the gubernatorial election of 1885, Fitzhugh Lee is elected governor. And that name is familiar because he is the nephew of Robert E. Lee. And so he is one of we'll call them the redeemers, who brings about the return of the conservative Democratic Party political control over Virginia. And so throughout the rest of the 1880s and into the 1890s, you see Virginia's conservative legislature pass laws that continue to restrict the vote for Black Americans. And they decide in 1901 to have a full constitutional convention, and they sign in 1902 a constitution. Now they don't send it to referendum because it was so contentious, they knew it wouldn't pass. So they actually just adopt the 1902 Constitution. They sign it with this pen and wipe out 90% of the Black male vote in Virginia and 50% of the white male vote in Virginia. And they codify the Jim Crow policies and really wipe out Black political power across the state, and certainly locally in Richmond. It is not for another generation and a half until Richmond sees. Actually, y'all, I want to read a quote about that constitutional convention because it is so powerful. It was purposeful. Carter Glass, who is a representative from Lynchburg, Virginia, he says about the Constitutional Convention, discrimination, why that is exactly what we propose, to remove every Negro voter who can be gotten rid of legally without materially impairing the numerical strength of the white electorate. Furthermore, the 1902 Constitution has a felony exclusion law that today in Virginia in 2022 means that 1 in 7 Black Virginians who have been convicted of a felony cannot exercise their right to vote. So 1 in 7 Black Virginians cannot vote because of the felony exclusion law that was first formalized in 1902 and is carried over into the 1971 Constitution that we are operating under today. It's not until 1948 with the election of Oliver Hill. You see him here joining the city council, still under a ward system. And it's not until after a series, the Voting Rights Act of 1965 is passed, significant legwork on the part of the Crusade for Voters, organizing here in Richmond, along with a few Supreme Court decisions, were needed for Richmond in 1977 to have the first majority Black city council. And you see here Willie Dell and Henry Marsh celebrating. And Henry Marsh is from that council elected to be the city's first Black mayor in 1977. And we actually have his mayoral chair here in the Valentine in our collection. So who has a voice? It's a great section in our long-term exhibit. This is Richmond, Virginia. And I love it because it really does allow you to think broadly. And as we're thinking broadly about those different types of power that allowed people to have voices, we also should think about the power and the voices behind organized religion. And religion is the next topic that we're going to talk about. The Valentine, I'll make a quick plug for our first Freedom Center. If you have not been down to see our second location down there, please do go and visit it. And we interpret that site because it is the site where in 1786, the Statute for Religious Freedoms was passed, separating by law church and state here in the Commonwealth of Virginia. So it's on the books. And yet, in 1811, there's a tragic theater fire here in Richmond. 72 people are killed in that fire, free, enslaved, Black and white. And the community, in mourning and in trying to remember those that perished in the fire, they don't put up a monument. They don't try to create a cemetery there. Instead, what they do is they build a church. And you're seeing here the original plans for Monumental Church that are in our collection. There are catacombs underneath where those remains are still buried. The steeple does not get built. Otherwise, what you're seeing is what gets crafted at that location. And I do just like the idea that a church, I mean, we talk about monuments in Richmond all of the time. We often forget that this church is in of itself a monument. And the overlap of religion, politics, memory, memorial continues, especially as we move into the 1830s and the 1840s across the South. You see Christianity being used to explain why slavery is okay, that it is a good Christian is okay with slavery because it's in the Bible. It is mentioned in the Bible. It is okay, but also that that by Christianizing Africans and now African Americans by the mid-19th century, that is the duty of white Christian slave owners, and that they should use their religious message in order to help save, and again, I'm using air quotes, to help save their enslaved workers. We have in the Valentine's collection, we do have a bust here. This is Jeremiah Bell Jeter, who was one of the pastors of First Baptist Church. And he actually was the pastor in 1841 when that church split in half to serve white patrons in First Baptist Church, and then serve only Black members in First African Church. In 1841, it was a contentious split, but he did see that that slavery was not bad, because it was okay in the Bible. Jumping to after the Civil War, the church and organized religion continues to be extremely important, particularly after emancipation. You have churches like First African, but also Ebenezer Baptist Church down the road, serving as the home of freedmen's schools. And it is where newly freed Virginians, Richmonders, are starting school. We're talking in May of 1865. These churches were so ready to be able to educate those who couldn't read, gather together their community, celebrate emancipation, and figure out what that was going to mean for them and their families. That you have really these established fact churches being critical to understanding how you could become a citizen. 30 years later, though, the lost cause mythology has taken hold and has actually blended real religion with this civic religion. And you see here inside St. Paul's Church, you do see this window that is dedicated in the early 1890s to Robert E. Lee. You do not see a depiction of Robert E. Lee, you see a depiction of Moses. And in 1898, the same church has these beautiful stained glass windows. This is a scene of St. Paul, and this window is dedicated to Jefferson Davis. And so this blend of civic religion with actual religion, highlighting the glory of Jefferson Davis, who really, it took him dying for people here in Richmond to start liking him, along with the glory of Robert E. Lee as the savior of the South. People are worshiping under these windows, knowing that these, that and learning that Robert E. Lee was to be worshipped, that Jefferson Davis was to be worshipped. I would also like to note, I'm going to jump forward into the 21st century, that St. Paul's is doing excellent reparative work about this. In 2020, they rededicated these windows to the glory of God. And they also have partnered along with artist Janelle Washington. And you can actually go and see these paper artworks that are now installed inside St. Paul's. So really trying to take a hard look at their own role in propagating this lost cause mythology that denigrated Black Richmonders, while also lifting up the role and power of white Virginians. Religion can also be tricky in Richmond. And by the early 20th century, we had a large population of immigrant Italians who were Catholic, and they wanted to erect a monument because everybody else was erecting a monument, and they wanted to have their own, really to join the American cause. And they had latched on to Christopher Columbus. And so they wanted to give the city of Richmond this statue of Christopher Columbus. And the city of Richmond was very anti-Catholic in the 1820s. And it took them about 10 years. Took the Knights of Columbus and other supporters, took them about 10 years to get this statue installed in Bird Park. And I will again note that this one was pulled down in 2020 because today in the 21st century, we do acknowledge Christopher Columbus's role in the decimation of the indigenous populations here in North America through murder and disease. Our physical environment, though, how does organized religion continue, even outside of the framework of the lost cause, continue to support what is going on? And this is up at Forest Lawn Cemetery. This is the one of the first Holocaust memorials in the country. It's erected in 1853 by our very large and very active Jewish population here in Richmond. This was not a German immigrant Jewish population from the post-war period. This is actually an 1830s, 1840s immigrant population that had stayed here and again had decided to become American and really make sure that they were connected to the white community in the 19th century and the 20th century, but very active in the commercial businesses here in Richmond, and do erect at Forest Lawn Cemetery this Holocaust memorial. During the Civil Rights Movement, Black churches in Richmond are hugely important. This is a protest outside of Thalheimer's in 1960. Thursdays were the days that the ministers went to protest and picket outside of Thalheimer's. And so I'm just thinking that there was a regular day where Black ministers would go out and picket. One of the largest and actually Jewish-owned stores in town, I think, is worthy of note. And also in 1963, the SELC met in Richmond at the new building for First African Baptist Church, and Martin Luther King attended that. So this interplay of organized religion, of both lifting up that lost cause mythology and lifting up white supremacy, is also paired with resistance to it, again, 19th century and in the 20th century. And to help that along, they needed things to look at, and media is one of the other types of power that we want to discuss in the Reinterpreted Valentine studio. And we're defining media broadly. So I want to be careful and start with that explanation that media in this case is both the news media, like you probably immediately thought of, along with materials, visuals. You think of 2D media and art and 3D media and art. And so in thinking particularly of 3D media in art in Richmond in monumental form, we have a lot of it, and we have for a very long time. This statue of George Washington is still on view in Richmond at the state capitol. It goes on view in 1796, before the former president and leader of the American Revolution is even dead. It's sculpted by Jean-Antoine Houdon and is really, along with a bust of Lafayette, our first monumental work here in the city. George Washington is also the subject of our next monumental work, and you can still go and see on Capitol Square the George Washington Monument, and it is large. It was also meant to be a tomb. The Commonwealth of Virginia was really hoping to get George Washington's remains removed from Mount Vernon to Capitol Square. That did not happen, but you can see a door where his remains were going to be placed. This is completed right around 1860, at the start of the Civil War. But Washington loomed large in the life of sculptor Edward Valentine. And here you see, this is actually an 1859 ambrotype. And forgive me, Valentine is a little blurred out, but you can see here Valentine's copy of the Houdon bust of George Washington, along with his own bust of Henry Wise, who was a former governor of Virginia as well. Edward Valentine does these right before he goes off to Europe for the duration of the Civil War. And after the Civil War, monuments just are not the same. They're not figural representations, but they are using more ancient symbols. You see here the Ladies Memorial Association pyramid that is erected to honor the Confederate dead in Hollywood Cemetery. This goes up in 1869. In 1870, the Ladies Memorial Association of Oakwood Cemetery erects this obelisk. So again, ancient symbols that evoke memory, that evoke mourning of loved ones who had passed away. These are both in cemeteries. And you don't see figural representation in Richmond's statuary on a big scale until this guy comes into play. Some of you might have seen this map before. It's actually a plan for the Allen edition. And you can see at the center of that Allen edition, which is brought into the Richmond city limits in 1892, you can see the sculpture of Robert E. Lee. This monument is planned for. The cornerstone has been laid when this plan is created in 1888. So the final version of the monument wasn't even planned for, but it's just the one, right? You don't see a profusion of monuments. There was no plan in the 1880s or even into the 1890s to have a whole monument, a whole avenue dedicated to Civil War statuary. Robert E. Lee was so crucial to the Lost Cause mythology as the leader who led these valiant warriors into battle, who just didn't have enough men. They just didn't have enough machinery to overtake the Union Army. You could set aside that he had committed treason by fighting against the United States, whom he had sworn to protect after serving at West Point and in the U.S. Army. But he's so central to the tenets of the Lost Cause mythology as this savior for the South. And once you see in Richmond the Lee Monument go up, it really starts off a cascade. And if I've done it right, you'll see here a cascade of figural monuments, including A.P. Hill, Jefferson Davis. Actually, his body comes up too. He's buried there in Hollywood Cemetery. You see in 1894, you've got the Soldiers and Sailors Monument opens. You've got Extra Billy Smith in 1905. You've got Jeb Stuart. You've got Davis going up in 1907. You also have Stonewall Jackson going up in 1919, and Maury finishing off what by then is known as Monument Avenue in 1929. And it's all of these great men, and you're meant to look up to them. It's not actually until 1973 that Richmond has a monument to a person of color. And in this case, it's Bill Bojangles Robinson. And this still is up in Jackson Ward. But these monuments, these are meant to lift up. They're meant to inspire the viewers. They were purposely put in these very public places so that you would be inspired by, Lee's bravery or Stonewall's determination. But media has the opposite effect as well. And the promoters of the Lost Cause mythology knew that they could do a lot with imagery to take away power, not just add power, but to take away power. And I want to show you the image of a young boy. We do not know his name. We do know that in 1868, Edward Valentine paid him to bring coal into his studio. He actually showed up to ask Edward Valentine if he could move coal into his studio. And Edward Valentine, as one of the key sculptors of the Lost Cause, asked him to come back the next day and sit for this sculpture that he entitles The Nation's Ward. As a joke, humor is what Edward Valentine was going for. But here you have this young Black boy about the age of my son, maybe 7 or 8. And Valentine employs racist motifs to create this racist caricature, and then entitles it The Nation's Ward, as if this young boy couldn't take care of himself when he literally showed up to work at Valentine's studio. You also see a profusion of imagery. I'm just showing 2 plates here in our collection, a profusion of imagery of Black men with watermelon, that they are, not smart, again, denigrating, pulling away power. You see images of older women as mammies or in domestic servant roles, again, not allowing them to really fully express their own power. Similarly, here we have an image of, this is Henry Page. He was enslaved by the Valentine family and is not in any way the same man that you see here, that Valentine sculpts him as Uncle Henry, Ancient Regime, hearkening back to the days before the Civil War, when Henry Page was enslaved by the Valentine family and things were better. So you see the power to detract, to pull away, is being employed by the Lost Cause mythology, and also traditional media is doing the same thing. So a couple of headline comparisons here. This is the headline after the 1902 Constitution is enacted, talking about this great banquet for those guys that made this great Constitution. On the opposite side of the spectrum is John Mitchell Jr. talking about the unconstitutional constitutional convention that did all the damage it could to the Negro and has decided to adjourn. In 1924, when Virginia enacts the Racial Purity Act, not allowing members of different races to marry one another. This is published in the Richmond Times-Dispatch that the bill is a duty to one's white race. The Richmond Planet goes on to discuss the negative effects of that amalgamation bill prohibiting interracial marriage. So we've talked about media, we've talked about religion, we've talked about politics, we've talked about money. There is also just a brute type of violence, brute type of power. It's violence, tip of my hat there. And that is violence. And it is very visual here in Virginia. You can see here our state seal. It's in there, y'all. She just murders him. So murder is embedded in our state seal, but also I want to speak about August of 1800, when Gabriel helps organize a rebellion. They were going to leave from Henrico County, march down into Richmond, take over the capital, and kill the governor. This rebellion does not occur. There is a thunderstorm that squashes the organization that evening, and yet 26 of the people that were involved just in the planning of that are publicly executed around the state as close to their families as possible, it was noted, in 1800, so that their executions would serve as a lesson to those who were enslaved. Public executions do not go away in Virginia, and certainly by the 1890s, John Mitchell Jr. is leading an anti-lynching campaign into the 1890s, well into the 20th century. Even in Richmond, these are images from the 1960s of KKK meetings happening here up in Fulton. And then, just in case you weren't familiar, they let you know that the KKK is here. That threat of violence, even if not actual violence, the two of them paired take a toll, right? Take a toll on Black Richmonders, take a toll on Black Virginians. I'll jump into 2020 and just note that there is continued police violence in the city during the racial justice protests here in the city. And violence and war is actually the crux of one of our city's newest monuments. And the sculptor, Kehinde Wiley, notes in particular that war was a theme for him. It's an engagement with violence. Art and violence have for an eternity held a strong narrative grip with each other. Rumors of War attempts to use the language of equestrian portraiture to both embrace and subsume the fetishization of state violence. And so we've got this piece here in Richmond that really is bringing together art, media, and the history of violence that continues to affect and impact Virginians today. But I do like that it's at a museum because the last type of power that we're going to discuss in our remaining minutes is the power of education. My middle school teachers, for better, for worse, did make me write on top of all of my papers, knowledge is power. And I think it's a phrase we're all familiar with. And certainly the history of education here in Richmond is a testament to knowledge is power. I'll show you here Edward Valentine in 1862 in Berlin while he was studying to be an artist, to be a sculptor who was studying painting as well as sculpture. He does not come back to Richmond until 1865. His father's passed away. The war is over. And he returns home, bringing with him plasters like this one, a Paulino that he made while he was in Germany. But he's also returning to a Richmond that has freedmen's schools, has a new robust Black education system. You're seeing here the colored normal school, that its roots are established in 1867. This building is a little bit later. But again, Black Richmonders, Black Virginians, immediately after the war, focus on education as a path forward, as a path to economic prosperity, as a path forward to full citizenship. And Edward Valentine uses the negative power of 3D imagery to knock them down. And in 1873, he casts this work that he entitles Knowledge is Power, of a young Black boy. And you can see here actually the change from the original maquette, the one where the leg is broken off. You have the young boy actually looking down and reading a book, whereas the final piece, he's asleep. And not engaging at all with this text. And again, the humor that Valentine is trying to employ speaks to the real truth that education was a means to a path forward, and it was classical education that Valentine was employing when he created this very large marble sculpture of Andromachesteinax. Now they're Trojan figures, probably not people that y'all are familiar with. Don't roll off the tip of your tongue, but Andromache was the wife of Hector. Hector is killed in battle, and here she is holding her surviving son, Astyanax. This piece is crafted and finalized in 1893. It's exhibited at the Columbian's Exposition in Chicago. And by 1894, art historians, college professors around the country are using this piece to describe the model of Confederate womanhood. So you see the layers of the lost cause mythology as it relates to women taking care, nurturing the veterans, nurturing their children, raising the next generation of white supremacists, being layered on to this classical piece. Our local museums certainly were participating in this as well. The Valentine Museum had a Confederate room when we opened to the public in 1898. And again, we prioritized white histories for almost an entire century. The Museum of the Confederacy down the street was opened by the United Daughters, partnered with the United Daughters of the Confederacy. Lots of membership overlap there, and you could go and learn about the history of the Confederacy, but you would not also be learning about the history of slavery. The UDC ladies that were involved with the MOC, the CMLS, wanted their message to be outside of museum walls even, and they enacted a large national campaign that had a lot of local impacts to erect monuments, in particular the Jefferson Davis Monument you see here just prior to its unveiling in 1907. The Jefferson Davis Monument has embedded in its base these dates: 1607, 1776, 1861, and 1907, the year it was erected. And they purposely wanted Edward Valentine to attach the history of personal liberties from the Cavaliers who came to Virginia in 1607 to the ideas of freedom and rebellion in 1776 with the start of the American Revolution, and tie those to secession of 1861. They wanted that narrative. They wanted it embedded in this monument. And I'll show y'all a picture of it right before it was pulled down in 2020. The UDC also knew that they could do these public education moments with monuments. They could support museums that could tell lost cause stories. They also had an active textbook campaign. And here in Richmond, in particular, you have the historian for the Virginia Division complaining in 1932 that a proposed textbook teaches the stark fallacy that the sole cause of the war was slavery. Well, of course, we know that the sole cause of the war was slavery, but by pushing back and getting the textbooks that are being used by, kindergarten through 12th grade students across Virginia, they're able to create a generation of folks that believed these narratives, right? That believed that slavery was not the cause, that believed that African Americans were better off under the systems of slavery. And so what you're looking at here is actually a 1964 textbook that the UDC did not need to be involved in. The politicians that got these textbooks passed had grown up with the UDC versions, and therefore we're perfectly happy to have quotes like this, that life among the Negroes of Virginia in slavery times was generally happy. In a chapter about the English settlement of America, which of course was inhabited by indigenous peoples, they said that the English settlement brought about a better life for both the settlers and the Indians, totally downplaying warfare and disease that decimated those populations. Similarly, thinking of the post-war period, the interpretation of Reconstruction in these textbooks, one of them notes, some broad-minded Northerners came to understand and appreciate true Virginia and came to agree that Negroes were not ready to govern themselves. So you see these textbooks, again, printed in the 1960s, used first by primarily white schools, passed down to primarily Black schools. You see these textbooks really becoming what people, when do you start to question what you're taught in school, right? Maybe in high school, maybe in college. When Richmond first integrates its schools in 1960s, there's still this pushback, right? You still have the legacies of racism. It goes through into the 1970s with the anti-busing campaigns that were successful. And actually see here a picture from Henrico showing that they're having a victory party because neighborhood schools will continue to reign. The history of white supremacy and racism in our schools continues today. This is actually from a moment in Richmond where there were going to be some elementary schools that had been primarily white students and primarily Black students that were going to be paired. You see here a school board meeting where some parents are saying we should get over it and allow our schools to be paired, but there was significant pushback, so much so that discussion was eventually tabled, and those schools did not pair to provide a fully integrated experience for elementary students. So the power of education, let me start from the bottom here, the power of education, the power of violence, the power of media and religion, politics and money. It's this web of power that brings about the lost cause mythology, resists it, but also continues to impact us today. And so while y'all are thinking about which of those you think might still be impacting our community, your community, I'm going to do some quick hits, and then I think we've got some questions in the chat. There is a survey that if you don't mind dropping it into the chat, we would really love for y'all to participate. Again, we are still working on this installation and this interpretation. Your feedback is going to help us make sure that this installation is the most beneficial for the Richmond community, the whole Commonwealth of Virginia, the whole country. So if you don't mind taking a few quick minutes to fill out that survey. And for those of you that may be watching the recorded version later, please do reach out or use the link that is still available on the screen. Also, just want to note, Liz plugged our Power Play tours that are coming up this summer, but we are also willing to do small group tours. If you are a part of a group or would like to bring your group to the Valentine, have myself or one of the co-curators or one of our other staff members come and talk to your group about this topic. We are perfectly happy to do that. And of course, can do virtual presentations as well. And then some upcoming events, walking tours, Oasis concert series, those additional on-campus tours this summer, along with those educator workshops. And of course, if you have questions, please do not hesitate to reach out to me. My email address is on the screen. And so now with that, I am hoping that someone will please ask a question. And Liz, I might ask you, just you've had a chance to review some of the comments going on in the chat. I might ask you to moderate that if you don't mind.
Absolutely. So there's been 2 great questions thus far, and I'm sure maybe people are thinking. One that was asking for some clarification around incarceration laws that you were talking about, I think with the 1902 Constitution. Did that only apply to Black citizens, and were they the most targeted group of people?
So the felony exclusion part of the 1902 Constitution does actually have some history. It had been not part of the state constitution prior to that, but there were laws in the books that if you had a felony conviction that you were not able to vote in local or statewide elections. So certainly that had been around. You see mass incarceration happening again in the 1860s, 1870s as a way to continue to control the Black Virginia population by keeping more people incarcerated. They actually were able to hire them out through lend-lease systems and make the state more money, to continue, I should say, the state making more money off of the labor of those who were in the care of the state. So there is a 19th century precedent there. It is with the 1902 Constitution that it's really embedded, and it's not one of those things that is actively revised in the 1971 Constitution, like so many other parts were. There have been executive actions to this date that have allowed some of those who were convicted of felonies to regain their right to vote, but not yet at that constitutional level where it's going to be permanent. Virginia is only one of, I want to say, 7 or 8 states in the Union that has that Felony Exclusion Act. So we are a little behind, but that's a great question. It was targeting Black Virginians as, again, another means to control their bodies and control their access to the vote.
Okay, there's another question I'm going to share, and I think I'm just going to read this one. So it says, will you speak about Joseph Bryan, who may have had the greatest influence and promotion of lost cause mythology with his monopoly of foreign newspapers, and as the first president of the Virginia Historical Society and political influence regarding Virginia textbook society?
My man, Joseph Bryan. Yes, he is. He and his wife are a power couple. I will also add, she is very active in the United Daughters of the Confederacy, and key to getting those windows funded as well at St. Paul's Church too. So the two of them, Joseph Bryan, for those who are not familiar, he controlled the 2 major newspapers in Richmond, both the Times and the News Leader. They merge in 1903 to become the Richmond Times-Dispatch. And so he uses the power of the press, both the morning edition and the evening edition, to thoroughly propagate lost cause mythology by both inclusion, right, telling stories that lifted up the Confederacy as well as denigrating Black Richmonders. He also chooses what gets into the paper, and so does not tell the stories of, let's say, Maggie Walker and John Mitchell Jr. in any light, much less a favorable light, like say the Richmond Planet is doing. So, can we say he's a Rupert Murdoch type guy here in Richmond, by controlling the news channels, by what people are reading, that media that they're consuming. He is able to have a major impact.
Thank you. I mean, we've been talking a lot tonight about ideas and content that are in the works for the sculpture studio, but there's a question more about the sculptures themselves, and maybe about if you could give us a little sneak peek of what you're thinking visually for the space.
So visually, the space is going to have a lot less in it. Again, it's only 600 square feet. We would like for people to have some mental space to really process some of this heavy content. I think you all can agree now that it's some fairly heavy content that we want people to work through and then walk out into the world and see things in a different way. Most of those sculptures that you saw in the early slides, how quickly can I get back to, this is a question, in that those early slides are going to be put into storage. So one of the important things about that is that we are one set of staff members at the Valentine that has been operating now for 4 generations. We are not going to let these things go. They will just remain in storage, and future folks can do with them what they would like to do. So we're going to have key pieces still will be included. We're going to use the works of Edward Valentine to ground these different elements of power and how they tell the story of the lost cause mythology, its growth, its hopeful demise. But yeah, we want people to have more space to be able to breathe and to not have quite as many old white men looking down at you while you do that. It's a great question. Oh, I'm seeing another question here. The impact of the 1902 Constitution. Why wasn't there enough anger generated by that to bring together disenfranchised white men and the African American population? So that is a great question, Tree. And it was because racism was so embedded in our society that white men couldn't say, well, at least I'm not Black. They were not going to come together politically again like they had, I should say, during the 1870s and 1880s. The idea that you were white in Richmond gave you a step up. So in order, if you wanted to then partner or politically work with Black Richmonders, it was never going to be in your favor because, again, the racism was so embedded by the 20th century that it really did take huge efforts of Richmond's, Virginia's, the America's Black leaders to be able to override that. There was one more question that I didn't see, Liz.
It's the big one. Literally, someone was asking, where will the big sculptures from Monument Avenue end up? Do you want to speak to that a little bit?
That is a great question, and one that is going to take some time to decide. Let me note that the Lee Monument that was formerly on Monument Avenue took 20 years to be constructed. The Fitzhugh Lee statue that had been in Monroe Park took about 50 years to get erected. Public art in Richmond takes its time to go up, and it's going to take its time. And we want to be really thoughtful about where these pieces, not only the, let's say the metal artworks themselves, but also where those pieces of granite end up. And we are supporting the Black History Museum as they work through that process. They have been given the statues and the pedestals by the city of Richmond. And so we are here to help support with our resources, with our archives, what they will determine that process to be is still forthcoming, but there will be some sort of public process to engage folks. I will say, if you attend any of the light-based art projections that are coming from Reclaiming the Monument, the guys that were projecting on the Lee Monument last year, they have additional projections that are going to be going up around the city in June and in August and in October. And at those events, we are there supporting them, but also collecting feedback about the future of public arts to share with the Black History Museum, as well as to share with the city. I want to, though, make very clear that there is a process for determining what is happening with the things that came off of Monument Avenue, and a totally separate city-led process for what will happen next on Monument Avenue. And that is still city land. Again, we'll be supportive of that process, but the Valentine is not going to be leading the way on what is coming next. We are history folks, not future folks. So we will just pass over our feedback to other people and let them do with it what they will.
All right. Thank you so much. I think that was the last question that we've had. I know we've gone a bit over time. So thank you, Christina. This has been wonderful. And thank you to our audience.